Long shadows were thrown on the marble flooring of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa as the morning sun broke through the glass walls. As Ethiopia's capital awoke, diplomatic cars with tinted windows pulled up in a deliberate procession, their engines humming. The air conditioning fought the growing heat inside the locked conference room, producing a nearly sterile atmosphere that appeared to foreshadow the impending clash of worlds. 3 nations worth of security officers stood in strategic positions, their earpieces ringing with secret messages. The tension that pervaded the air like morning fog blended with the aroma of Ethiopian coffee, and confrontation that no one had foreseen was about to occur in history. In a very inappropriate show of power, President Donald Trump's convoy arrived with the customary pomp, American flags flapping in the African wind. His advisors, whose comments carried the contemptuous tone of those who had never really comprehended the continent's new generation, murmured last-minute briefings about the young African leader they were going to see. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, meanwhile, had arrived half an hour earlier in a plain black vehicle with just 2 security guards, rather than in a motorcade. His military uniform was pressed and elegant as he sat quietly going over documents, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who has overthrown countries with strategy rather than words. Before a single word was exchanged, the contrast was already striking. In the most unexpected diplomatic encounter of the decade, 2 opposing ideologies of power were set to clash. In preparation for what many thought would be an impossible encounter, the mediator, an old Ghanaian diplomat, shuffled his papers anxiously. The arrangement of the room was purposefully neutral. 2 flags at equal heights, a headless round table, and translation tools that would be superfluous. Being the youngest head of state, knowledgeable in several languages, and having researched his rivals with the accuracy of a military strategist, Traoré's reputation had already preceded him. The intellectual depth they were about to experience was entirely lost on Trump's team, who had briefed him on another African ruler. The scene was set for a conflict that would be fought with only moral authority and pure intelligence, not with money or weapons. The air itself appeared to change, as both leaders walked in at the same time, infused with the energy of 2 very different approaches to leadership coming together in person. Trump's signature swagger contrasted dramatically with Traoré's tranquil manner, generating a dynamic that instantly drew everyone's attention. Each man had adequate time to measure the other during the precise 3-second handshake. Something moved between them in that instant. Acknowledgement, opposition, and possibly the initial indication that things might not turn out the way either party had expected. Africa was poised to demonstrate to the world the true meaning of intellectual sovereignty as the fight of the wits got underway. Trump straightened his tie and sat down in his chair with the assurance of a guy who has closed billion-dollar agreements on every continent. His gold cufflinks gleamed in the light. With a faint chuckle, he started, "So, Captain," stressing the military title, "I hear you've been making some noise in your part of Africa." His advisors nodded in agreement, their briefing folders full of Altuve intelligence that portrayed Traoré as just another attention-seeking coup leader. The American delegation had braced themselves for what they believed would be a routine meeting with an African strongman, whom they could easily subdue with political clout and economic pressure. With a dismissive glance around the room, Trump was already estimating how soon this meeting would be over. Later that day, he was set to meet with leaders from the real world. With his hands folded serenely on the table, Traoré stayed still as he watched his opponent's initial moves and studied Trump's body language with the analytical accuracy of a chess master. In addition to studying Trump's speeches and ideas, he had spent weeks studying the psychological trends that influenced his choices in order to be ready for this moment. Traoré viewed an elderly businessman whose success had been based more on bluster than substance. While Trump's team saw a young African soldier, the skipper remained silent on purpose. He was aware that impatient men sometimes showed their frailties when compelled to occupy quiet, uncomfortable areas. His dark eyes conveyed a level of intellect that Trump's briefing materials had totally missed. No one in the room had expected this to be as interesting as it was. When Traoré eventually responded, "I've heard great things about your golf courses." His English was clear and unaccented, taking Trump by surprise. The American president's expression brightened with astonished delight. Trump began describing his most recent resort construction with much passion, clearly not expecting this young African leader to be aware of his economic empire. He described championship golf layouts and marble fittings. His advisors looked at each other in confusion. They had not prepared for such an aggressive negotiation posture. Traoré paid close attention, nodding occasionally and posing targeted technical queries that revealed an unexpectedly deep understanding of managing upscale hotels. The chemistry in the room had already changed in ways that were difficult for Trump's crew to understand. Trump was unaware that Traoré's initial salvo was a psychological warfare masterclass masquerading as light chat. In reality, every query on golf course design probed Trump's priorities, decision-making process, and basic comprehension of value creation. Traoré was methodically charting his opponent's intellectual domain, while the American president reveled in what he saw as adulation from an African leader. The most important fights were won before the adversary knew they were being attacked. as the captain had learned from his military experience. Unaware that he was already being outwitted by a mind that functioned on a level he had never experienced, Trump carried on about his properties. The trap was placed correctly, and the underestimate was complete. Traoré's voice maintained the same respectful tone as his inquiries got laser-focused. And the shift from golf courses to global economics was so seamless that Trump hardly noticed, pulling out a leather portfolio filled with paperwork that appeared far too structured for a casual diplomatic discussion. The captain added, "Your business success is impressive, Mr. President, but I'm curious about your perspective on resource partnerships in Africa." Sensing an opportunity to show off his bargaining skills to this young leader who had showed such proper regard for his accomplishments, Trump straightened in his chair, leaning forward a little. The American delegation recognized the familiar ground where their president usually performed well. As though he were truly interested in learning from the expert negotiator, Traoré's pen hovered over a notebook. The environment was friendly, almost instructive, which added to the tragic nature of what was about to happen. "Africa has tremendous potential," Trump said, making wide gestures as he began his usual tirade about unexplored markets and natural resources that need to be properly developed. His speech had the assured cadence of someone who had made innumerable presentations of this kind to investors and world leaders. Thoughtfully nodding, Traoré occasionally made notes that appeared to support Trump's arguments, giving the impression that a pupil was receiving guidance from an instructor. Seeing their president in his element and teaching another world leader about economic realities made the American advisors a little more at ease, as he described possible mining operations, agricultural alliances, and infrastructure projects that could revolutionize the continent. Trump's motions grew increasingly heated. He was so engrossed in his own story that he failed to notice the cunning intelligence concealed behind Traoré's watchful exterior. "That's fascinating," said Traoré courteously, as he opened his portfolio to show well-arranged charts and financial projections. His tone remained respectful, almost subservient. "But I wonder if you could help me understand something about these resource partnerships." Trump gave a generous nod, obviously happy to answer whatever straightforward query an African leader might have regarding doing business internationally. The captain's finger followed a string of figures that contrasted the local economic impact in different African countries with the revenues from resource extraction. His tone remained constant as he started to provide evidence that would methodically refute all of Trump's recent presumptions. Unaware that the intellectual battleground had just changed beneath his feet, the American president continued to smile. "According to these World Bank figures," Traoré added, his dignified demeanor concealing the accuracy of a surgeon doing the initial cut, "in the majority of resource partnerships in Africa, local populations experience less than 3% economic improvement, while 87% of revenues leave the region." As Trump's aides hastily rummaged through their briefing materials, looking for counterarguments to facts they hadn't expected, the atmosphere in the room abruptly altered. When Trump realized that these weren't the gentle inquiries he had anticipated from a young African military leader, his self-assured smile faltered a little. Traoré kept writing in his notepad, not just statistics but also behavioral observations, regarding his opponent's responses to sudden intellectual tests. The session had only just begun when the deferential student revealed himself to be a superb economist. Trump's business instincts saw a problem that needed quick reaction to preserve psychological dominance, and his jaw tightened as he analyzed the statistics. "Those numbers don't tell the whole story, Captain," he continued, sounding as contemptuous as he did when speaking to reporters who posed awkward questions. He began his well-known justification of infrastructure development and job creation, pointing to his advisors who were still fumbling through their files for evidence. The atmosphere in the room had changed from friendly instruction to rivalry. Trump's gold pen tapped the table in a repetitive manner that revealed his mounting annoyance as both delegations realized that this was no longer a cordial diplomatic conversation because of his years of experience in business discussions. He knew how to rapidly restore control when a conversation descended into awkward area. As he turned to another portion of his painstakingly produced portfolio, which featured satellite footage of mining operations throughout West Africa, let a tiny smile slip across his lips. His eyes shone with intellectual joy as he said, "You're absolutely right about job creation, Mr. President," in a tone that maintained impeccable diplomatic decorum. The photos, which featured expansive extraction sites encircled by underprivileged neighborhoods and included comprehensive job data, refuted all of Trump's recent claims. He stroked with his finger the lines separating poor local villages from lucrative mining zones. No verbal argument could have been as crushing as the visual proof. The captain's tone stayed composed and courteous, but each word was carefully chosen to highlight the core problems with Trump's philosophy. The aides to the American president looked at each other with growing concern as they recognized that their briefing materials were utterly unsuitable for this kind of intellectual warfare. "In Burkina Faso alone," Traoré added, revealing a spreadsheet that showed years' worth of economic data with the accuracy of a military operation. Foreign mining companies extracted $2.3 billion in gold, while local employment increased by only 0.7%. When Trump realized he had fallen into a trap, his face turned red. Statistics that made his lofty promises seem like empty rhetoric damaged his corporate pride. The American delegation observed their president grapple with information that contradicted his preconceived notions about the economics of Africa. Although Traoré's presentation was unrelenting, it was presented with such professionalism that Trump was unable to criticize the messenger without coming across as unprepared and defensive. The American president was failing his first exam, and the young captain had turned the conference room into a classroom in which he was the professor. The presumption of Trump's intellectual superiority was further undermined by each graph and chart. Traoré remarked, "These partnerships you mentioned, with the quiet authority of someone who had truly seen the effects of economic colonialism, they remind me of contracts my grandfather signed in the 1970s. Trump's commercial training was unable to counter the personal reference, which struck like a guided rocket and turned abstract data into real-life human experience." As he explained how promises of wealth have repeatedly fallen short for African communities, the captain's eyes were filled with decades of inherited wisdom. Trump opened his mouth to answer, but when he faced the fact that his opponent wasn't merely intellectually prepared, he found himself at a loss for words for the first time during the meeting. He was so emotionally committed that every disagreement felt very personal to him. Everyone in the room could feel the American president's increasing desperation, and Traoré had total control over the economic battlefield. Traoré grabbed another folder and closed his economic portfolio. As Trump watched in increasing alarm, he moved slowly and deliberately. "Mr. President, because we're talking about partnerships, maybe we can look at how African ideas on international accords are shaped historically?" The leather-bound folder opened to reveal colonial maps overlaid with contemporary resource extraction zones, a visual correlation so striking that even Trump's advisors couldn't ignore the implications. Traoré's finger traced the boundaries of former French colonies, demonstrating how current mining concessions followed nearly identical patterns to territorial divisions in the 19th century. The room fell silent as the young leader transitioned from economist to historian, his quiet authority filling the space between them. Trump's business confidence began to crumble as he realized he was about to receive an education he had never expected. With the rhythm of a university lecturer speaking to an especially unprepared student, Traoré began. The Berlin Conference of 1884 divided Africa among European powers without a single African representative present. Trump shifted uneasily in his chair, his scant understanding of African history suddenly seeming like a glaring weakness in front of this extraordinarily intelligent young leader. Maps demonstrated how artificial borders created dependencies that lasted long after independence, with modern corporations simply replacing colonial administrators in exploiting the same systematic vulnerabilities. The captain's presentation exposed how colonial boundaries had been drawn to maximize resource extraction, while purposefully fragmenting ethnic groups and traditional trade routes. Trump's advisors frantically took notes, realizing their briefings had catastrophically underestimated their opponent's intellectual depth. The American president's face grew more red as he faced the uncomfortable reality that his business empire operated within systems rooted in centuries of exploitation. The captain's voice remained steady as he described how promises of development and partnership had been used to justify resource extraction for over a century. Each historical parallel to modern trade agreements was delivered with surgical precision, methodically dismantling Trump's worldview while maintaining perfect diplomatic courtesy. "What's fascinating," Traoré continued, turning to a page that included photographs of his own grandfather in military uniform, "is how these historical patterns continue to influence contemporary economic relationships." The personal dimension hit Trump like a physical blow as he realized he was arguing with someone whose family had experienced the consequences of every policy he was defending. The American president was rendered speechless by the depth of historical knowledge that made his real estate background appear embarrassingly superficial. The young leader's eyes held the accumulated wisdom of ancestors who had seen empires rise and fall through the same tactics Trump considered innovative business strategies. The captain's historical lesson had turned the conference room into a courtroom where colonialism itself was on trial, with Trump unwittingly cast as the defendant. "My grandfather taught me that those who ignore history are condemned to repeat its mistakes," Traoré said, his words carrying the quiet menace of a man who had studied his enemies across centuries. Trump's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his usual arsenal of insults and deflections useless against an opponent who spoke with the authority of lived experience spanning generations. The history lesson was finished, and Trump's worldview was in ruins, as the American delegation watched in terror as their president realized he was being outwitted by a man who was young enough to be his son. "Let's talk about real security, Captain," Trump said, his voice regaining some of its characteristic bravado as he leaned forward aggressively. The American president began outlining military aid packages and security partnerships, his tone suggesting that African nations needed American protection to survive in a dangerous world. Trump's face hardened as he realized the need to move to more familiar territory. His business instincts told him to pivot toward discussions of military power where America's superiority was undeniable. Trump's gestures became more animated as he described advanced weapon systems and training programs, clearly believing he had found the topic that would expose this young African leader's limitations. His advisors nodded approvingly, finally seeing their president return to ground where they felt confident about their nation's advantages. The energy in the room changed as the discussion shifted from history and economics to military strategy and projecting global power. Traoré's face stayed completely composed, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes that indicated Trump had just entered his domain. He answered, "Military strategy is indeed crucial, Mr. President," with the serene assurance of someone who had led men in battle rather than just buying defense contracts. Opening yet another portion of his prepared documents, the captain found in-depth analysis of recent U.S. military operations in the Middle East and Africa, with the accuracy of someone who saw war as a lived reality affecting human lives and national sovereignty rather than an abstract policy tool. His finger traced mission timetables and casualty reports. Upon realizing that their opponent's military credentials were not ceremonial, Trump's advisors exchanged anxious looks. This was a man who, rather than inheriting fortune, had used strategic genius to topple regimes. There was more treachery to come on the intellectual battlefield. With the fluency of someone who had studied every American military intervention in Africa over the previous 20 years, Traoré continued, "Your military aid to Chad, for example," his eyes displaying the strategic mind of an experienced commander, while his voice maintained diplomatic courtesy, resulted in $847 million in weapon sales, but failed to address the root causes of regional instability. When Trump realized that this young captain had in-depth knowledge of classified operations that even some of his own advisors weren't completely briefed on, his confident smile started to wane. According to the presentation, American military assistance frequently exacerbated rather than resolved crises, establishing dependencies that favored arms makers over the security needs of Africa, with the clinical detachment of a trained soldier who has witnessed empires fall apart due to strategic overreach. Traoré's analysis was sharp and precise, demolishing the mirage of American military dominance. As Trump tried to come up with answers to criticisms based on real combat experience, the crowd became uncomfortable, quiet. The words struck Trump like artillery shells, each one specifically aimed at revealing the basic flaws in American military doctrine when applied to African conflicts. The interesting paradox, Traoré noted, his tone changing to that of a military academy instructor speaking to a failing cadet, is how the world's most expensive military consistently struggles against opponents who understand their own terrain better than foreign advisors ever could. As someone who had personally outmaneuvered forces armed and trained by major powers, the captain's voice exuded authority. Strategic thought, not technological dominance, was the foundation of his success. As Donald Trump faced the fact that his opponent was more than just a bright student, his face became more and more pale. He was a successful military tactician who had vanquished adversaries with significantly more resources than he had. When the American president realized that every effort to show dominance had instead exposed his own deep limitations, his palms trembled a little. Another area where Donald Trump was totally outclassed by a man he had written off as simply another African coup leader was military strategy. Trump's breathing became visibly deeper as he realized that this young African leader, who spoke with unwavering moral authority, had methodically decimated every area he thought he was an expert in. He continued, "Look, Captain," with a hint of desperation slipping into his voice, "at the end of the day, leadership is about getting results, about winning." The American president resorted to his most fundamental beliefs, that power was its own affirmation, and that achievement justified any means while making wild hand gestures. His advisors were more alarmed as they saw their leader's poise continue to erode under the constant, intellectual pressure from a foe they had miscalculated. Trump's wrist shook as his gold watch glinted in the light, revealing the tension his voice was attempting to hide. The anxiety of a guy who realized that his entire worldview was disintegrating in real time had made the mood of the room oppressive. Ibrahim Traoré reclined in his chair, his demeanor exuding the serene assurance of someone who had at last arrived at the point he had been striving for during the entire interaction. "Mr. President," he uttered, his voice laden with ancestors, knowledge, and accumulated experience. "True leadership isn't about winning, it's about serving something greater than yourself." Like thunder, the statements shattered the room, revealing a conceptual divide between two utterly irreconcilable conceptions of authority and accountability. In stark contrast to Donald Trump's growing agitated energy, the captain's eyes retained the calm stare of someone who had sacrificed all for the freedom of his people. The precision of a skilled philosopher making a concluding, devastating argument would characterize his following words. There was a sense among the American delegation that something significant and irrevocable was going to occur. The intellectual struggle was coming to a head. When I took power in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré went on, his voice getting louder by the second. I didn't do it for personal glory or business opportunities. I did it because my people deserved leaders who would die for them rather than profit from them. As the captain talked about duty, sacrifice, and the moral responsibilities that come with having control over human lives, the two men's conceptual divide widened into an impenetrable gap. Donald Trump's expression twisted as he tried to understand a worldview in which success was determined by the freeing of others rather than by material wealth, and where leadership meant service rather than dominance. In contrast to Trump's commercial accomplishments, the young African leader's speech exuded the sincerity of someone who had truly put his life in danger for his beliefs. Each word was a philosophical hammer to the core of the American president's conception of leadership. As the full impact of the moral disparity became evident, the room fell into startled stillness. Traoré responded, "You speak of winning, Mr. President, with the authority of a man who had prevailed in the only conflicts that really counted, those for national sovereignty and human dignity. But what have you actually won for your people? Beyond division and debt?" Everyone in the room realized that Trump was unable to respond to the philosophical question, which hovered over his eroding confidence like a sword. The moral authority of the captain filled the void between them, and the weight of true leadership based on sacrifice and service overshadowed the wealth and power of the American president. Trump's lips trembled silently as he faced the heartbreaking truth that he had lived his entire life collecting success symbols without ever knowing what true leadership entailed. The philosophical blow had struck with surgical accuracy, revealing not only academic shortcomings, but also a basic lack of spirit that could not be concealed by wealth or influence. Everyone could see that Donald Trump was helpless against an opponent who battled with values rather than business margins. When the war was almost done, Trump's normal arsenal of insults and deflections was made entirely worthless against an opponent who spoke with unquestionable moral authority, and his hands started to shake noticeably as sweat beaded on his forehead. He sputtered, "You don't understand," his voice rising to a pitch that sounded more like desperation than strength. "I've built an empire. I've created jobs. I've made America great again." He struggled to find any argument that might help him regain his psychological equilibrium in a battle he was obviously losing, and the words came out in a desperate rush. His advisors were horrified to see their president's renowned selfish disintegrate before their very eyes, reducing him to reciting campaign slogans like a malfunctioning tape. When his composure finally started to completely crumble, the gold pen in his shaking fingers clattered on the table. As everyone in the room saw one of the most powerful men in the world be destroyed intellectually, the atmosphere had grown tense. Watching the American president's psychological collapse develop in real time, Ibrahim Traoré stood motionless, his dark eyes displaying a mix of despair and sympathy. He murmured quietly, "Mr. President," with the firmness of a parent scolding a bewildered kid, "an empire built on other people's suffering is not an achievement, it's a tragedy." The remarks struck Trump's collapsing mind like physical blows. Every sentence was carefully crafted to reveal the hollowness at the heart of his alleged achievement. The contrast was exacerbated by the captain's composed manner. His unwavering poise draws attention to Trump's more unpredictable actions. He knew just how to break through an opponent's final psychological barriers, and his next remarks would be delivered with surgical precision. As their leader drew closer to total intellectual capitulation, the American delegation could only watch in helplessness. Everyone in the room could sense the seismic shift that was taking place, and the breaking point had arrived. Trump's face turned a frightening shade of red. His breathing grew more labored, and his body language revealed a man who had never been forced to face the moral consequences of his actions. "Your greatness," Traoré continued, his voice now bearing the weight of historical judgment, "is measured by how many people you've exploited, not how many you've liberated." The constant philosophical assault was delivered with such composed assurance that Trump was unable to even come up with a well-reasoned defense. His typical strategies of deflection and personal assaults proved ineffective against a rival who spoke with unquestioned moral authority. After decades of self-deception and meticulously crafted mythology, the captain's remarks left Trump vulnerable and psychologically exposed. Everyone could tell that the defendant had run out of defenses, and the room had the atmosphere of a courtroom when the final verdict was being given. In the face of intellectual and moral superiority he had never experienced, Trump's renowned ability to dominate conversations was reduced to unintelligible stammering as his mouth opened and closed. Repeatedly, like a fish gasping for oxygen, he stammered, "You can't." This isn't his disjointed syllables betraying a mind that had lost all capacity to reason under duress. In a desperate attempt to find backing from advisors who were also startled into silence by the systematic carnage they had seen, the American president's gaze flew wildly about the room. His hands gripped his tie as though releasing it would somehow let him exhale the oppressive weight of his own blatant insufficiency. In less than an hour, he had gone from being a self-assured dealmaker to a devastated man. His reasoning and entire sense of self had been destroyed at the breaking point, rendering him psychologically helpless to fend off the inevitable fatal attack, with the accuracy of a military leader planning a last-ditch attack. Traoré looked at his watch while his voice lowered to a whisper that somehow attracted more attention than any yell could have. His statements were delivered with surgical calm. Mr. President, you have exactly 3 minutes to explain to me why Africa should trust American leadership when your own people are abandoning you, he said. The realization that this was no longer only a philosophical debate caused Trump's eyes to widen in fear. It was a planned, well-timed execution. Everyone in the room knew instinctively that the final countdown would begin when the captain's finger tapped once against the table. There was no anger in his dark gaze, just the icy assurance of someone who had meticulously planned this moment. As their president faced an intellectual firing squad with no ammunition left to defend himself, the American delegation sat motionless. Sweat trickled down Trump's face as he strained to articulate intelligible sentences, his voice breaking like thin ice under pressure. I built my business as he started. Every defense mechanism and pretense he had ever constructed was torn away by Traoré's unrelenting gaze, causing the words to splinter and die in his throat. His renowned confidence was diminished to the pitiful stuttering of a man who had finally met his cerebral superior as his hands thrashed frantically in the air, searching for arguments that were no longer there. Trump's mouth moved silently. As the captain's timer resumed its silent countdown, his brain seemingly unable to comprehend the total annihilation of all he believed to be true about leadership and power. The world's most powerful man was reduced to a bewildered, stuttering shell, as his advisors watched in horrified amazement. The collapse was occurring in real time, with terrible efficiency measured in minutes and seconds rather than hours or days. Softly. 2 minutes remaining, Traoré said, his voice expressing the finality of a judge imposing a sentence on a convicted man whose appeals had run out. In an attempt to regain some of his old authority, Trump's breathing became labored and urgent, but the words that came out were ramblings about golf courses and TV ratings. Because the captain's psychological warfare had been so thorough, the American president was unable to discern between his political and corporate successes, and his intellect was unable to come up with a defense against charges based on moral authority that he had never had. The weight of his own inadequacies had smashed his capacity to think clearly, causing his face to turn an unsettling shade of purple. Decades of meticulously crafted self-mythology fell apart in less time than it took to boil coffee, leaving the audience in startled stillness. The 3-minute countdown had turned into a public demonstration of Trump's self-perception. Time, Traoré remarked plainly, his one word blending into the quiet like a tombstone being laid over Trump's body. As his brain gave up its final effort to comprehend what had happened to him, the American president sat slouched in his chair, his mouth hanging wide. The lifeless look in his eyes belonged to a man who had been so thoroughly defeated that he had forgotten what it was like to win. The captain's job was completed with the accuracy of a master strategist who had planned every move from the start, and he closed his portfolio with a gentle snap that sounded like thunder in the oppressive silence. As they gazed at their leader's shattered body, Trump's advisor saw the whole cerebral devastation of a man who had never faced an adversary who could completely destroy his entire worldview in precisely 3 minutes. Everyone in the room, who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives, witnessed the complete and irrevocable collapse. With the fluid grace of a man who had just finished a mission that stretched well beyond this one room, Traoré stood from his chair, his military attitude emanating the peaceful satisfaction of justice at last done. Trump was slumped in his seat, his once dominant presence diminished to the shattered shell of a man who had realized his own intellectual poverty too late, and the silence seemed to last forever. Each advisor realized that they had observed something far more important than a diplomatic discussion when the captain's black gaze went across the American group. After centuries of condescension, they had witnessed the symbolic restoration of African dignity. With a final snap that seemed to reverberate through the halls of history, his leather portfolio closed, signaling the end of a time when anybody could minimize or ignore Africa. Even though the young leader maintained his poise, the historical significance of what had just happened was evident to everyone in the room. This event would go down in history as the day Africa regained its intellectual sovereignty on the global scene. Not as a personal triumph. His decades of diplomatic experience had not prepared the Ghanaian mediator to see such a comprehensive intellectual deconstruction delivered with surgical precision and unflinching moral authority. And he sat in startled silence, as his head reeled from the total breakdown of everything he had ever believed about himself and his role in the world. Trump's breathing had become shallow and erratic, and his eyes were staring blankly at the table's surface. The American advisors exchanged appalled looks, understanding that they would need to somehow explain to the world how a young African leader they had written off as unimportant had brought their president to a catatonic state. The only sound, in a room where the balance of power in the world had just changed in ways none of them completely understood, was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Traoré's triumph was more than just a personal triumph. It signified the rise of a fresh wave of African leaders who would never again submit to intellectual colonization by the West. Everyone in attendance realized that the planet had undergone a fundamental transformation after the restoration was finished, with the cool authority of someone who had just demonstrated that preparedness, moral conviction, and knowledge could overcome wealth, power, and conceit. Traoré added, "Gentlemen, I think this meeting has served its purpose." He spoke to the group, but his eyes stayed on Trump's shattered body with a look of regret and sympathy that was somehow more heartbreaking than any outburst of rage could have been. With precise and unhurried movements, the captain meticulously gathered his supplies, exuding the assurance of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. The weight of centuries of African struggle, from ancient kingdoms to contemporary liberation movements, seemed to be carried by his military uniform as it culminated in this cerebral victory. The American delegation sat still, unable to comprehend how rapidly reality had upended their preconceptions about African leadership. One destructive dispute at a time, the dignity that had been methodically robbed of a whole continent was being restored. Traoré hesitated as he approached the door for one last time, then turned around to say something that would reverberate in diplomatic circles for decades to come. "Mister," with the soft firmness of a teacher giving a last lesson to a pupil who has failed miserably, he remarked, "President, Africa is no longer waiting for your permission to be great." The remarks, which hung in the air like a proclamation of independence, signaled the conclusion of this encounter, as well as the start of a new era in international affairs, when moral authority was more important than economic power or military prowess. Trump's head was still lowered in defeat, and his silence was an unavoidable admission that he had been completely outclassed by a man he had misjudged, with disastrous results. With a gentle click that sounded like the turning of the last page of history, the door closed behind the captain, revealing a room where American haughtiness had been permanently buried and African dignity had been totally restored. Everyone was aware of the winner after the combat was over. The intellectual devastation was total. Trump's 3-minute meltdown revealed the flimsy basis of Western haughtiness in the face of Africa's burgeoning genius. Traoré's surgical accuracy demonstrated that moral authority, not inherited riches, is the ultimate source of power.